Could you expand on this concept of nirvana or nibbana in Pali and explain
Yep.
some misconceptions about it as well? For example, it's not quite a Buddhist heaven to which one goes in the
No.
afterlife.
Nirvana, the metaphor is kind of beautiful. Buddhism, like most philosophical and religious traditions, is built on lots of metaphors. And when you recognize the fact that the world is metaphorically burning with suffering, what you want is to put that fire out. Now, when you recognize that the world you live in is a world that's out of your control, that's always headed downhill from your perspective, then you understand what the Buddha meant when he said suffering is ubiquitous. And anybody who thinks it's not, I think is delusional.
Hello and welcome to the discussion. This channel is here to serve as a platform for thoughtful conversations about God, philosophy, history, religion, music, and more. My name is Nahoa, and I'm here to ask questions, to seek truth openly and critically, and to share the journey with you. I've been exploring philosophy, trying to understand the fundamental nature of reality, how we can know it, and what we can do about it, what we should do about it. For the most part, I've studied philosophy from Western professors thinking within a broadly Western framework, and their work is very, very valuable to me. But in preparation for this video, I've realized that there is also a vast wealth of philosophy in Buddhist tradition. Starting with Siddhartha Gautama in Nepal about 2.5 millennia ago, Buddhist doctrine was soon developed by great Indian philosophers. It spread to China, where it interacted with Taoism and Confucianism, and then through China to Tibet, where there was a systematic transmission and translation of ancient Buddhist literature. So in this discussion, we will explore and learn about Buddhist philosophy. The scholar joining and teaching us today earned his bachelor's at Oberlin College and both his master's and doctorate at the University of Pittsburgh. He's a professor of philosophy at Smith College and Melbourne University, a visiting professor at Harvard Divinity School, an adjunct professor at the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. He has taught Eastern philosophy to Western audiences and Western philosophy to Eastern audiences, emphasizing the importance of recognizing the value in both. His book, Engaging Buddhism, is a fantastic work devoted to explaining the Buddhist worldview and its contributions to metaphysics, logic, philosophy of language, ethics, etc. So, without further introduction, Dr. J. Garfield, how are you?
I'm doing just great, and thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be on your show.
Thank you for coming on, and I'm honored to have you on and excited to ask you some questions. Before we get sort of into the weeds, I have a question about what Buddhism is. Right? So it has often been said, at least in the West, that Buddhism is more of a philosophy than a religion. And while there is a beautifully rich philosophical tradition within Buddhism, as I've been learning and as we'll discuss, there also seems to be more than just philosophy. Right? So foundational Buddhist texts are seen by many Buddhists as authoritative scripture, according to the respective school. Buddhist figures are seen as holy people. And I know this isn't representative, but I went to a temple and I saw monks, I saw offerings and worship, etc. So
Yeah.
could we perhaps describe Buddhism as a philosophical religion? I don't know. How would you describe Buddhism?
I'd say the Buddhist civilization is really complicated. And that if we look at the role that a religion plays in a people's lives, Buddhism plays that role. It's a source for rituals. It's a place in the context of which institutions like birth and death and marriage are celebrated. It's a way of coming to terms with the world. But it's also a religious tradition that, as you pointed out, has generated a very complex and rich philosophical tradition. So, just as Catholicism, for instance, or Judaism or Islam have generated tremendously rich philosophical traditions, but still quite reasonably have lives as religions in the context of the cultures in which they thrive, the same could be said of Buddhism. That is, Buddhists who grow up in Buddhist cultures often think of Buddhism as the source of their religious views. But we don't have to be involved in Buddhist rituals. We don't have to be attentive to the sacred, as it were, in order to learn from Buddhist philosophy. Similarly, lots of people who may be deeply religious and deeply involved in Buddhist rituals know very little about Buddhist philosophy, just as, for instance, many Catholics or many Jews or many Muslims may be deeply religious and devotional, but know very little about the philosophical traditions in their traditions. So this this distinction between philosophy and religion is a very hard one to draw in some contexts. In the West, we usually draw it because of what happened in the European Renaissance, when religion and science kind of parted company after the Galileo controversy, and philosophy followed science and became thought of as opposed to religion. But in Asia, there was no Galileo event, and the philosophical and religious traditions have continued to go hand in hand for a very long time and continue to do so today.
Now, I understand that you went to a conference about science and Buddhism with the Dalai Lama, and that yeah, you reminded me of that by talking about the sort of Renaissance distinction between science and religion. So, could you
Yeah.
tell us a bit about that conference?
Sure. There have been quite a number of these, and I've been at several of them that have been administered by the Mind and Life Institute, which is an institution very much designed to bring together Tibetan Buddhist scholars and modern scientists, and also people in the humanities and social sciences. But the focus has been largely on either physics and cosmology and quantum mechanics on the one hand, or cognitive science, psychology on the other. And they've been explorations of where Buddhist scholars and Western scientific scholars can find common ground in trying to understand things like the fundamental nature of physical reality, or um, the nature of consciousness, the nature of thought, the relationship between mind and body. Explorations to find out whether Buddhist contemplative techniques or philosophical theories can enrich Western science and understanding of the mind, and on the other hand, whether Western scientific techniques can help to shed light on or to deepen Buddhist analyses. And they've been very fruitful conversations by and large. Sometimes you find people are talking past each other and you don't really get very far, but sometimes you get really very, very interesting collaborations. And they've generated an enormous amount of very valuable scientific research, as well as a very fruitful engagement with modern science in the context of the Tibetan Buddhist community.
Now, you have also highlighted the importance of recognizing Buddhist literature in the Buddhist literature and thought in the field of philosophy, not merely in
Yeah.
some separate, Eastern or Indian studies. You argue that Buddhism has so much to contribute. So, to give context to our coming discussion of Buddhist metaphysics and ethics, please tell us why this worldview matters so much to philosophy.
Right. It matters for a lot of reasons. As you pointed out in your introduction, most people, and this isn't just true in the United States or Europe, but all over the world, when they approach the discipline of philosophy, are taught nothing but Western philosophy, what happened in Greece and Europe, and then later North America and Australia. Um, and they're taught that as though that's the only tradition of rational inquiry into the nature of reality in the history of humankind. And quite frankly, that's not only bullshit historically, but it's also dangerously racist and colonialist. Um, I've always said that when you think of philosophy that way, you should think of it as a subdiscipline of white studies or something like that. It ignores the intellectual traditions of India, of China, of Africa, of Native America, of Mesoamerica, of Tibet, all of these traditions that have traditions that are absolutely as rich, as analytical, as penetrating as the Western tradition. So there's a political and moral issue here. Part of the political and moral issue is that to ignore the intellectual traditions of all cultures that aren't European is to kind of continue in the colonialist project of imposing European culture on everybody else. But it's also stupid because each of these traditions, these people aren't idiots, right? It's not like only white people can think. Um, and they've produced really interesting ideas and really interesting insights. And so by ignoring them, we're not only doing something that's politically and ethically reprehensible, we're ignoring good ideas and good insights that we can find elsewhere. It would be as though you decided to say, I'm only going to read books published on Mondays. The ones published on Tuesday through Friday, forget about those. By doing that, you end up just ignoring 4/5 of the material that's ever been published. Similarly, if we say I'm only going to read material published in the European tradition, and I'm going to ignore everything that anybody who's Chinese or Indian or African, Native American ever did, is to deprive yourself of ideas that could otherwise be beneficial to you. A third reason is that even if all you really cared about was European philosophy, you don't really understand it unless you also understand what it's not. That is, unless you understand what it's missing, what it's not doing. And so, if you don't understand the global context in which European philosophy was constructed, you don't understand it. And moreover, if you think that any philosophical tradition, whether it's European or Asian or African, Native American, developed entirely in isolation with no interaction with any other philosophical traditions, then you are completely confused about the history of human ideas and human interaction. So even if, again, all you cared about was Western philosophy, the fact is that Western philosophy developed in dialogue with Islamic philosophy, with Indian philosophy, with Buddhist philosophy, and so forth. So, for all of those reasons, to ignore non Western philosophy is immoral, politically problematic, and intellectually foolish. So and I'm not the only one by any means, I've been one of many people arguing for the past decades that it's very important for philosophy to globalize in order to be really serving humanity much better and in order to develop more effectively as a discipline.
Hmm.
And I think studying Buddhist philosophy is only one aspect of that. So my view isn't, oh, gee, Western philosophy needs to be supplemented by Buddhist philosophy. It's that philosophers have to open their eyes. And one of the places to look when you open your eyes is the Buddhist tradition. Another's the Chinese tradition. Another's the African tradition. Another's the Native American tradition. Another's the Mesoamerican tradition. There's all of these different places. I happen to work in Buddhist philosophy, but I'm a booster for all of these.
Hmm. So, in light of that, partly to combat the sort of just unjustified Western bias, and also to pursue a broader, uh, or a broader in terms of scope and deeper in terms of the quality of our knowledge, to pursue better understanding. Let's take a look at some of the innovations of Buddhism.
Mhm.
And so
Sure.
the Buddha in his first discourse, setting in motion the wheel of Dharma, he talks about the Four Noble Truths, which sort of
That's right.
serve as the foundation of Buddhism, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
And so,
absolutely.
okay, and so to ask the first question, he talks about the ubiquity of dukkha. Am I pronouncing that right?
You are pronouncing it beautifully. Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
he talks about the ubiquity of dukkha. So just to begin, what is dukkha? Because that's a Sanskrit term and it's often translated suffering, unsatisfactoriness, etc. What is dukkha and how do Buddhists understand its pervasiveness?
Okay. That's a really good question. And I want to begin by backing up one line on the slide and pointing out that when we talk about the Four Noble Truths, they're not so much truths that are noble themselves. There's nothing noble about the truths. They're truths that make one noble, or truths
Mm,
that noble people should care about. Some people prefer to translate that as the four ennobling truths, or the
mm,
four truths for the noble. So that's just a bit of clarification because people look at that and say, what do you mean the truth is noble? That doesn't make any sense. That's just a bit of a translation issue. So let's talk about dukkha. As you pointed out, dukkha is most often translated as suffering, and I think that's actually a very good translation. But sometimes it's translated as unease, unsatisfactoriness, dissatisfaction, discomfort. All of those are okay too. It connotes the idea that things aren't right, that the world is not completely satisfactory, and that in fact the world is permeated by what I'm now just going to call suffering, because I think that's the right the right way to translate it. Because when we think about suffering, they mean something that kind of happens to us that we don't want to happen, something that we would like to have alleviated. Nobody says, I love to suffer. People might even like pain, but if they like pain, it's because they don't think of pain as suffering. Um, Nobody wants to suffer. Suffering is something that happens to us that we want to avoid or to eliminate. Now, when we talk about the ubiquity of dukkha, we're talking about the fact that dukkha, or suffering, is part of the most fundamental structure of the world. And Buddhist philosophers divide suffering, or divide dukkha, into three different kinds. And I want to work through those three kinds to give you a sense of what it means to say that suffering is really ubiquitous. The first is the one that is best translated as evident suffering, but you often see it translated just as the suffering of suffering, or the suffering of obvious suffering. And evident suffering is things like headaches, cancer, famine, war, toothaches, annoying noises, all of the pain, all of the discomfort, all of the death and destruction that we experience in life. And part of the Buddha's insight was that the world that we inhabit is absolutely chock full of it. I mean, just read the news. Look at what's happening in Gaza right now. Look at what's happening in Somalia. Look what's happening in Ukraine. Look what's happening in the flooding in your home city of Los Angeles. Look at people who do not have homes on the streets of our own country. There's suffering every place. Now, some people would say, well, that might be true, but it's not really ubiquitous. Those people are suffering, but I'm not suffering right now. I feel just fine. Maybe you're sitting on the beach with a margarita. Maybe you're watching a fabulous podcast about Buddhism, and you say, life is really great for me. You ask somebody, how you doing? They say, I'm doing just great. But then ask yourself for a minute, if knowing everything I know about what's happening in the world, I say I'm doing just great, then one of two things is happening. Either I really don't care about what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening to homeless people on the street, what's happening to people who can't afford to send their, get medicine, all of that. I don't care about them. In which case, I'm suffering from being an asshole. I'm suffering from being somebody who can't look in the mirror and say, I like that guy. Because none of us would say, the kind of person I want to be is the kind of person who really doesn't care about what happens to anybody else. And by the way, I want to raise my kids that way too. So there's always a sense of unease or suffering that we have, in even if we're not responding. But if we are responsive to other people's suffering, then we're suffering too. Because you can't be totally happy when you know what's happening to other people in the world, even if your own life is very fortunate. And so part of what the Buddha was saying is that if you look at our world, it is full of real serious unhappiness, terrible diseases. Even if you're not in the war zone, you might have an illness, you might have cancer, you might have AIDS, you might have COVID, you might get malaria, headaches, all of that stuff. Um, so And so his point was that the ubiquity of that and its unavoidability means that we live in a place that is unsatisfactory. We'd rather it not be that way. The second level of suffering is what we call in Buddhist philosophy the suffering of change. And that has two aspects. One aspect is that all of the phenomena in the world are impermanent, including us. So when I look at you on my screen, you're young and healthy and vigorous. And if you look at me on this screen, you see an old guy who no longer has any hair, who's, kind of on the way out and all of that. And kind of what you want to say to anybody your age is that this is what you have in your future. That's if you get lucky, and live that long. So part of the suffering of change is that basically we have to confront the fact that we're all corpses in the making, and that every day we live is a day closer and closer to our own decline and death. And part of the suffering of change is just that everything, including us, is going downhill. And again, you might say, well, I don't think that's the case. I'm just going to stay, forever 21, as the store says, and just be young all my life. But of course, that's just delusional. The only way to stay young your entire life is to die young, and nobody wants to do that. Um, the other aspect of the suffering of change is that things that we really like and that seem to be sources of happiness, if they go on too long, become sources of unhappiness. I mean, you know this if you sort of get a gallon of chocolate ice cream and you say, wow, I'm going to have a great afternoon. And those first few scoops are really good. The third and fourth one, it's getting kind of boring. And then eventually you just start feeling really sick and the ice cream is just disgusting. Or you think about that song where when you first heard it, you just couldn't get it out of your mind and you played it again and again and again. You thought, I'm going to love this song for the rest of my life. But now you can't stand to hear it. Or if this podcast, goes on for half an hour, that's cool. It goes on for an hour, that's cool. But if we talk for 3 or 4 hours, nobody's going to be listening. And the reason for that is it's going to get boring. So part of the suffering of change is that even things that are sources of happiness eventually become sources of unhappiness. And the third and deepest level of suffering, and one thing you can see, by the way, is that the suffering of change is part of what's at the root of the suffering, the evident suffering. Because when you think about it, a lot of what makes suffering is that even if we're happy now, we know that our situation is going to change. It might change just by reading the newspaper, or it might change because, we develop a backache or something like that. But the suffering of pervasive conditioning is what underlies all of these. And the suffering of pervasive conditioning is the fact that everything that happens to us depends upon countless causes and conditions that are out of our control. So, for instance, you might do everything right in your life. You might be a really good person. You give money to charities. You help out in your local homeless shelter. And then you go to the gym and work out to stay healthy. And you do everything right to make your life good. That doesn't prevent some drunk driver running you down tomorrow afternoon. It doesn't prevent an heritable disease suddenly springing up and you discover that you've got a horrible form of cancer or something like that. It doesn't prevent a pandemic occurring. It doesn't prevent somebody going to war far away and that having impact upon you. So when we recognize that we cannot control our own lives, even though we would love to be in control, even though we do everything we can to be in control, and by not being in control of our own lives, suffering comes to us whether we want it or not, and good things turn sour whether we want them or not. We age and become more feeble whether we want to or not. That inevitability and an inability to control our lives is itself a source of suffering. Because again, if we think of suffering as an unfortunate circumstance that we'd rather not have, this is that. Now, when you recognize that that is what permeates your entire life, the world you live in is a world that's out of your control, that's always headed downhill from your perspective, and that is full of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, then you understand what the Buddha meant when he said suffering is ubiquitous, that all of this is permeated by suffering. And anybody who thinks it's not, I think is delusional. So coming back to the question with which you framed this entire show, what does Western philosophy have to learn by paying attention to another tradition? The world has never been thematized in this way, setting up the fundamental problem of human existence as what do we do about the fact that the world is not the way we want it to be and that our lives are basically unsatisfactory. That was an insight that the Buddha had. And once you point it out to people, it's just perfectly obvious. But the remarkable thing about being a human being is that we are phenomenally good at ignoring what's right in front of us. We're phenomenally good at ignoring the obvious. And part of the Buddha's insight was that our inability to face these obvious truths is itself a further source of suffering because we don't end up doing anything about it. Great example, climate change. It's really obvious. Everybody knows the facts. And collectively, we're doing a phenomenally good job of ignoring it. And by doing that, it doesn't cease to become a source of suffering. It becomes a greater source of suffering. Once again, just illustrating what the Buddha and his followers said about the pervasiveness of dukkha.
Hmm. Now, would the Buddha also affirm that along with the ubiquity of dukkha, there's also sort of a coinciding ubiquity of goodness and beauty? Or would he say that the unsatisfactoriness of life is deeper or more fundamentally pervasive than the goodness in life?
That's a good question. There are a lot of beautiful things in life, right? There's friendship, there's kindness, there's flowers, there's beautiful sunny days, there's peace. All of those things happen. But they're all inframed in this background of pervasive dukkha. There's a wonderful line in the 8th century Buddhist philosopher Shantideva's book called How to Lead an Awakened Life, Bodhicharya Avatara, in the 7th chapter, where he says that pleasure in the ordinary world is like licking honey from a razor blade. Um, and I think there's something deeply right about that. Yeah, the honey tastes good, but you're licking it from a razor blade.
Hmm. I see that. Okay, I need to think about that more. Um, but I appreciate that insight. Now,
And so, from the Buddhist standpoint, the only way that happiness can be complete is if you eliminate suffering and eliminate that web of suffering. So, when we think about the Buddhist path, it's primarily a path to the the amelioration of suffering.
hmm,
That's the problem that sets Buddhism going. So, one way to think about the entire Buddhist philosophical and religious framework is that once you recognize the first truth, the ubiquity of suffering, then life becomes a problem,
hmm,
a problem to be solved. Just like if you wake up and you say, damn, I've got this really splitting headache, you've got a problem to be solved, and you go to the medicine cabinet and look for the aspirin. Or if you find yourself outside and it's suddenly pouring rain, you say there's a problem to be solved and you find your umbrella. Um, if you think that the pervasiveness of suffering in your life is a problem, then the Buddha said you've got to find a solution, and the Buddhist path is about a solution to the problem of suffering.
hmm. And before you can understand the solution, you also have to understand the causes, which is
That's
what the second no or the second ennobling truth is about. It's about the origination of dukkha or suffering. And so
exactly.
there there are three, if I understand, there are three main causes of suffering. Or you could think of it as two, grasping and ignorance, or three, desire, aversion, and primal confusion. So
Yep.
could you tell us first about attraction and desire? So these are I understand how they can lead to unnecessary suffering in many cases, especially when
Mhm.
jealousy, gratitude, or misperception of a painful circumstance are involved. But sometimes desire and aversion seem to be good. For example,
Mhm.
say a seeker desires to have right view, to have right speech and
Mhm.
action, and to be free of suffering. I mean, these desires seem virtuous and even necessary to pursue the Buddhist solution. Conversely, being averse to and even horrified by particularly horrendous evils seems morally healthy as well. In your book, you write, the Buddha also assumed that suffering is a bad thing. If one
Yep.
disagrees with this assessment, moral discourse has no basis. There is no problem to be solved, unquote. So this nearly
Yep.
appears to imply that the Buddha himself was averse to suffering. So I'm just wondering, how does a Buddhist rebuke attraction and aversion?
Well, that is a very beautiful and profound question. Um, and I'm going to come at it again by coming back to Shantideva in How to Lead an Awakened Life, and this time continuing to talk about the 7th chapter, um, which is the chapter on commitment. Um, there's a really nice, this is, and by the way, this is also one of those places where I think that the Buddhist world offers a distinctive contribution to psychology and moral psychology that is largely absent in Western philosophy. So we're going to talk a little bit about the structure of the origin of dukkha. I'm going to talk for a little while now. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the structure of attraction and then the structure of aversion. And then connect those to primal confusion to make it clear why what you've said misses a very subtle point that's developed in Buddhist moral psychology that is easy to miss if you come at it from an exclusively Western perspective. So
Okay.
first, when we talk about attraction and aversion as what I'm going to call the proximal causes or the immediate causes of suffering, it's like this. And it's not a very difficult or deep point, but it's an important point. Um, One of the ways that you suffer is by wanting stuff that you don't have. I mean, that's the basis of the great Janis Joplin song, Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz, right? If I don't have a Mercedes Benz, that's not a source of suffering unless I also want one. Um, when I want it, but I can't get it, there you've got it, right? Um, and aversion is similar in structure. That is, we have suffering not when we have something unpleasant, but when we have something unpleasant that we don't want. So, for instance, physical pain may be something that people don't want, but sometimes people actually like physical pain. And I don't mean just being weird. I mean, anybody who's played a sport knows that sometimes what you're doing really hurts, but it's fun. Because that's not pain that you say, I don't want. I mean, the marathoner doesn't say, damn, this is getting painful. I'm just going to stop running. The football player doesn't say, boy, these hits are really a problem. I'm going to go play ping pong, right? Um, Pain by itself isn't suffering. Pain plus aversion to pain is what makes it suffering. Um,
This reminds me
so,
of a song by an artist named Daniel Caesar, and he
mhm,
has a lyric where he says, "Pain is inevitable, misery is a choice," which seems like
exactly.
the Buddhist view, and especially in the Yogacara tradition, that yeah, I mean, certain certain aspects of life are just they're going to happen, but it's about how you perceive it and whether or not you're averse to it happening that determines whether or not it's suffering.
That's exactly right. I think that's a beautiful line. And I'll turn to another lyric from the Indigo Girls, right? Who are my big favorites. Um, we're better off. It may not it may not feel it when it's sticking to your skin, but we're better off for all that we let in. And allowing yourself to experience with pain without being averse to it it can be a real source of learning. But when we look at what suffering comes from, it immediately comes from either wanting what we can't get or not wanting what we've got. And the Buddha argued that those are both grounded in a kind of deep primal confusion, often translated as ignorance. And that is the idea that I'm somehow an ego who could simply have all of my desires satisfied and everything would be great, and never have anything that I'm averse to. And that my goal in life is to make sure that the world kind of revolves around what I want. Um, and it's that kind of idea, and also the idea that I am independent of everybody else. So that I could simply have these things. I could be happy in those ways. All of my desires satisfied, all of my aversions eliminated, regardless of what happens to anybody else. Now, as I said, we have to think about the structure, though, of attraction and aversion, because as you pointed out, the Buddha thought we should be disapproving of wrongdoing and suffering, and we should be approving of virtue and attitudes like care and friendliness and so forth. But we can draw a very nice distinction, one that's drawn in Buddhist moral psychology, but not drawn as frequently in Western moral psychology, between attraction or desire and aspiration, between aversion and disapproval or indignation.
Hmm.
Um, and I want to explain those distinctions because I think they're really important. So I said the rooting in the fact that the kleshas, the pathologies of attraction and aversion, are rooted in confusion means they're rooted in a kind of egoism, a sense that what I want or what I don't want is what's important, and what's important to my real happiness or real unhappiness. And that's an aspect of fundamental confusion. So when we think about what you need to motivate action, everybody, whether Buddhist, Western, anybody, believes that you both need knowledge or belief and then some kind of conative attitude, a motivational attitude towards that. It's one thing, for instance, to know that there's chocolate ice cream around, but I don't go to get the ice cream unless I also want it. It's one thing to know that I've got a headache, but I don't take the aspirin unless I don't want it. So we need, in addition to a knowledge state, a conative state, a motivational state.
Right.
But in a lot of Western philosophy, we think that the only motivational states are states like attraction and aversion. The Buddhist idea is, though, that those states, while they are motivational, are egoistic. That is, I want it because it would be good for me, or I don't want it because it's unpleasant to me. The Buddhist idea, though, is that we can also have impersonal conative attitudes. So instead of wanting something because it makes me happy, I can aspire to something because it's a good thing. Instead of being averse to something because it makes me unhappy, I can disapprove of that thing because it's a bad thing and get my own ego out of it. So let me give you examples here. Four of the kind of four great cardinal virtues, if you want, they're called in the Buddhist world the Brahma Viharas, or the divine states, thought of as the really important kinds of characteristics to cultivate morally, are Maitri, or friendliness, Karuna, or an attitude of care, Upeksha, an attitude of impartiality, and mudita, which is a harder one to translate, an attitude of sympathetic joy, of being able to take real pleasure in the success of others as opposed to oneself. So if we think about each of these, they're each really good things. It's great to cultivate an attitude of friendliness. That's an attitude of wanting to benefit others, wanting to help others. It's a great thing to cultivate an attitude of karuna, an attitude where you want to relieve the suffering of others, an attitude of care. It's really important to cultivate an idea of impartiality, where you treat all people as worthwhile and important and having dignity. And it's really important to cultivate an attitude where you can rejoice in other people's success. But the great Buddhist philosopher Buddhaghosa pointed out that each of these has what he called a far enemy and a near enemy. So to take an example, if we think of the first one, friendliness, well, the far enemy is just hostility. That's what it is. That's kind of the opposite of friendliness. And we can all recognize that as a vice, if you're just plain nasty and unfriendly to other people. But Buddhaghosa pointed out that there's a more dangerous opposite, if you want, of friendliness. And that's what he called partiality. So you might say, I'm a really great friend because, like, I help my friends, and I make sure that other people don't get the goodies. So I got my friend this job and made sure somebody else didn't get it. Or I'm a really good friend to my kids because I make sure that they get ahead and other people's friends don't, other people's kids don't. And that kind of partiality feels good, and it masquerades as a kind of friendship or a kind of virtue, but it's really undermining. And what Buddhaghosa pointed out was that the big difference between real friendliness and partiality is that the second one, the partiality, is egocentric, and real friendliness is not egocentric. When I'm partial, I want something good for somebody else because it makes me feel good to see them succeed, or because there's something in it for me. When I'm really friendly, I want something good for somebody else because it's good for them, not because it's good for me. That's an aspiration, not a desire. Similarly, if we're thinking about the attitude of care, of karuna, Buddhaghosa said the opposite, of course, is just coldness, not caring about other people's suffering. But the near enemy is sloppy sympathy, when I am really upset that somebody else is suffering because it makes me feel bad, oh, gee, I see these pictures of people starving in Somalia right now, and it makes me feel terrible to see them, so I'm going to send some money. Well, that's better than not caring at all. But if I'm caring only because it makes me feel bad, that's egocentric. That feels like aversion rather than disapproval. And we could go on and on. But the point is then that when we say that we don't want the world to be full of suffering, we can think of that as a kind of um, disapproval or a recognition of the badness of suffering, but not an egoistic aversion to it. When we say we'd like other beings to be happy, we can see that as an aspiration for other beings' happiness, not a desire that other beings be happy so that it makes me feel good. And so it's getting the ego out of it, getting the egocentricity out of our motivations that's central to this. So when we come back to the point that we made earlier about happiness in the ordinary world being like licking honey from a razor blade, the point there is that it looks like happiness, but in the end, because it's egocentric, it becomes nothing but one more source of suffering.
Wow, that is a powerful distinction between impersonal approval and disapproval or recognition of something as good, just in virtue of how it affects other people, regardless of whether of our feelings about it. Basically, the
No,
distinction between that and then a more personal affection, which includes the affection and aversion that the Buddha rebukes. Okay,
that's right.
I
And if
think
we
I
think
think
about
I'm.
it, if we think about it in terms of anger, that can come home really
Mm,
quickly for many of us. So let me talk about that a little bit because I think that anger and patience are one of the things that most of us deal with a lot as a pathology and a virtue. Um, And there are people who think that, for instance, when you see injustice or inequality or just bad behavior by somebody else, that the right response is anger. And that if you're angry, that really shows that you care. But Buddhists point out that that's actually really wrong. When you're angry, you're never at your best. You can't
mm,
think clearly. You kind of lose it. Nobody's ever said, wow, I'm glad I got completely out of control angry that day because, boy, I was really smart and I really worked well. That's when you apologize. You say, oh my God, I know I overreacted. I know I said stupid things. I really regret that. But even if we're talking about things like injustice or inequality, if you're angry, then your emotions are going to cloud your responses and you can't think clearly. It's much, much better to be disapproving, seriously disapproving, righteously indignant towards injustice or towards people's bad behavior, and then to think not about how can I get absolutely worked up emotionally about this, but to ask the question, what's the best way to solve this problem? And to ask that question and to answer it doesn't require anger. It requires calm, careful patience and a kind of dispassionate response. And so when we cultivate patience as opposed to anger, we're cultivating a non egocentric attitude towards wrongdoing. And we're always much more effective when we do that.
Now, the grasping that's seen as negative in Buddhism is rooted in it's rooted in that sort of primal confusion, and what
That's right.
people are confused about, according to the Buddha, is three main things. It's one, we live as though things and people are permanent, even though
Mm-hmm.
everything is transient and impermanent. We see
Yep.
ourselves as individuals in control and independent, even though everything is interconnected. In fact,
That's right.
relevant to this notion of interconnectedness, one of the fundamental concepts in Buddhist metaphysics is the doctrine of dependent origination, which is
Yes.
taken to entail emptiness. And
Yep.
I can describe it like that, but in full honesty, I have trouble fully wrapping my mind around these three. I want to call them features, but I know Buddhists are nominalists about properties. So, but for lack of a better term, features of ultimate reality, and
Yep.
especially emptiness, is difficult for me to understand. So, could you help to
Yeah.
clarify these ideas and how even those ideas are interconnected?
Sure. So let's start with impermanence, because for most people that's the easiest one to get to, and it's deeply connected to all the things we've been talking about. Again, there's always classifications. So Buddhists talk about two aspects of impermanence. The first one is what's called gross impermanence, and the second one, subtle impermanence. And gross impermanence is just the kind of impermanence we observe all the time. So that, it's sunny today, but it's rainy tomorrow. It's daylight now, it's going to be night later. Upon a time I was young, now I'm old. It's the fact that, things change. Now's the first quarter of the Super Bowl, now it's the second quarter of the Super Bowl.
Mhm.
Um, and the fact is that everything that we encounter in the world is impermanent in this sense. And we know that. Even mountains are impermanent. You look at the difference between the Rocky Mountains out west and the Appalachians where I live, and you see that, mountains erode over time and become soft and round and tree covered. Um, Everything's impermanent. The world is impermanent. The sun will go out. Um, the earth will collapse into it. All of this will happen. Species are impermanent. Each of us is impermanent. But that gross or general impermanence is underwritten by a subtle impermanence. And that's the fact that things are changing moment to moment. Everything is changing moment to moment. So, for instance, by the time I finish this sentence, I'll be a few seconds older than I was when I began. And that means that I'm actually a different person than I was when I began, a different individual. Why? Well, that individual was younger than the individual who's speaking now. And two people can't be the same if one is younger than the other. So even from moment to moment, everything is changing its identity. Before we began our conversation, I was somebody who didn't know you. Now I'm somebody who does. That's a different person. Um, and again, this is something that I think that um, people who have never encountered the Buddhist tradition find surprising at first, because we do respond to things as though they kind of are there for a while. And we say things like, "I will be eternally true to you" when we're in love with somebody, or we say, um, "We're going to this gift will benefit people all for all posterity into eternity," right? But eternity is a joke, because nothing lasts forever. But we also then think in terms of kind of persistence, and we fail to notice our own changes through time. And again, that's connected to things like anger and care. You get angry with somebody because you think they're a bad person, but you forget that somebody who does something unpleasant now may do something very pleasant a little bit later. Somebody who's affected by conditions that are really upsetting them and getting under their skin now may be a different person when those circumstances have paused and so forth. So when we think about impermanence, it allows us to think not only about ourselves, but about others, not only about others, but about our cultures, about everything as a process rather than an individual. And that allows us to kind of accept and a kind of momentary unpleasantness, thinking, okay, that's a stage in all of this. Um,
So
so that's
ultimately,
one.
Buddhists reject the metaphysical persistence of persons, right? And so if I
Yes.
look at a picture of me as a 7-year-old, that's not me as I am now, because according to Leibniz law, uh, or a Leibniz identity law,
Yeah,
if A and B are identical, then they have all properties in common. And
that's
I
right.
don't. I have many things that are different about me now than about the 7-year-old. And so
Exactly.
you would reject the persistence of persons.
Exactly. So what we think instead is that what a person is a continuum of states, continuum of psychophysical processes. And that brings us to the second point of interconnectedness or interdependence. Um, the second big issue, the second big characteristic of the world is that all phenomena arise in dependence on other things and then pass out of existence when those conditions are no longer there. And we think about there as being three dimensions to that interdependence. One is causal interdependence. So every event that occurs, like our speaking now, or the sun lighting up the earth, to occurs in dependence on previous causes. And if those causes that enable that thing to exist are no longer there, then that thing is no longer there. We get sick when we've got a bacterium or a virus in our body. When the bacterium or the virus goes away, we're no longer sick. So the idea that the formula in Buddhism is when this occurs, that occurs. When this doesn't occur, that doesn't occur. So that's causal interdependence. And we're all familiar with that. Things don't just happen causelessly. Everything happens because of the presence of countless causes and conditions. It's important to see this isn't a linear phenomenon. It's not this is the cause of this, followed by this, followed by this, but rather a network of causes and conditions. If I want a plant to grow, it's not enough that there be a seed. There also has to be soil. There has to be water. There has to be sunshine. There have to be the right temperatures. All of these things. There has to be the absence of a cow to come along and eat it. All of these positive and negative conditions have to be there. And so when we pay attention to the world around us, when we pay attention to ourselves, we have to recognize that we're not independent phenomena. We are these complicated conditioned phenomena. Those of us who remember the first Barack Obama campaign will remember his remark, "You didn't build this," talking to businessmen who said that you didn't create the conditions of your own success. Because even if you founded the corporation, you didn't build the roads on which your trucks run. You didn't build the trucks themselves. You didn't build the banking system that financed your work. You didn't do all the labor on the assembly line. Your workers did that. You probably didn't even secure all of the investment. Other people contributed, right? Trying to get people to recognize this level of interdependence in all things. A second level of interdependence is what
On
we
the
call,
note of causal independence, or of
yeah,
causal interdependence, um, there's an argument that was developed by an Islamic philosopher named Al-Ghazali, I think, about the origin of the universe. And so I'm curious, just kind of randomly, if a Buddhist acknowledges or accepts that there was an origin of the universe, would they say that there was some cause of the universe?
most Buddhist philosophers, in fact, all Buddhist philosophers, will say there was no initial cause of the universe. That
Hmm.
we to talk about that doesn't make any sense. Um, that even the universe had to have causes, and whatever the causes of those are had causes, and so forth. One way to look at that is that even if you think that the universe is finite in the past, as say modern physics tells us now that it must have been, and to have an origin in the Big Bang, that still doesn't give us a first cause. What it means is that time itself, in time, every event has a preceding moment. Um, but it also tells us that in the past, that's an open interval, so that we can get closer and closer and closer to that origin. And everything that is an event has a cause. But it doesn't give us a first cause, a cause outside of all of that. So Buddhists reject the idea that there's an uncaused cause of the universe.
I see.
Now, as I said, the second dimension, mereological or part whole interdependence. So whenever we look at something complex, like a computer or a person or a nation or a school or a dog or whatever you look at, it's composed of parts. And it depends for its entire function on all of the parts that constitute it. So I depend on my brain and my liver and my kidneys and my skin and all of that. Take those away, I don't function. On the other hand, Buddhists point out that the parts depend upon the whole. My heart can't just function by itself. It needs all of the other parts of my body to work. My kidneys can't just function by themselves. They need all of the other parts of the body to work. We can't just have a court system, but no legislation and no executive system and no people, right? Parts depend upon wholes just as much as wholes depend upon parts. And that's a really important thing to see because oftentimes, if we're thinking in this kind of naive reductive way, we think that we can explain the way that a whole works just by looking at the parts. But we forget that very often the only way to explain how an individual thing works is by looking at the whole that constitutes it.
Mm.
So if we wanted to explain, for instance, what you and I are doing right now, we can't do that just by looking at my heart and your heart, my lungs and your lungs, my skin and your skin. We also have to talk about the internet. We also have to talk about the history of Buddhist philosophy and Western philosophy. We have to talk about your viewers and listeners. We have to talk about the institutions that that employ me, and that have, the people who have taught you and the people who have taught me. And we can only explain what we're doing by looking at the larger wholes in which we figure. So part whole dependence has these two different dimensions: wholes on parts, parts on wholes. Now, third level of interdependence is the hardest one for many people to understand, but it's actually not so difficult. And it's generally called dependence on conceptual imputation. And that means that when we look at the things that in our world, in the world that we experience, and we ask, what makes them the things they are with the properties they have? Why is it that they show up for us in a particular way? That depends as much on our perceptual and cognitive apparatus as it does on the things themselves. And I'm going to give you two kinds of examples to try to make that a little bit clear. Here's one easy example. Think, for instance, about how money works. We all think that money is real. It's one thing to have it, it's another thing not to have it. If you walk into the cafe and you want to buy a coffee and you don't have any money, you can't get the coffee. If you do have money, you can get the coffee. So because money's got real effects, it's a real thing. But if we take a look at the pieces of money that we use, if you still use any cash at all, dollar bills or quarters or things like that, and you ask, what is it about them that makes them dollar bills or quarters? Well, it's not the intrinsic value of the paper or the piece of metal. There isn't $1 worth of paper in a $1 bill and 5 times that much paper in a $5 bill. There's not anything more valuable about the metal in a quarter than the metal in a nickel. What makes them more valuable is the fact that we've decided to assign collectively value to them, and that the Federal Reserve treats them that way, that the people with whom we buy and sell and hand them treat them that way. So that has to do with our conceptual activity and with our practices. That's what makes them the things that they are. And if we think about what makes a chair, it's the fact that we find it comfortable to sit in it. If we didn't, it wouldn't be a chair. But moreover, if we try to imagine the objects that we see around us, and you just look around the room that you're in now, and you ask yourself the question, what are the properties of the things around me? And you assign them properties like color or shape or size. You assign them identities. You say, okay, that's exactly what they are. Now ask yourself, if your dog comes into the room, what does your dog experience? Well, your dog doesn't experience the same colors that you do. Dogs have very different, much reduced color vision. But the dog experiences these rich smellscapes and volumes of smell that you don't experience at all, and sounds in the high frequency range that you don't hear at all. And so the room that the dog enters is a room with very different objects, very different properties than the room that you enter. And now imagine that there's a bee flying through that room. Bees see in the ultraviolet and the infrared through really complicated compound eyes that are integrating multiple perspectives all the time. And so the colors that the bee sees are wildly more florid and technicolor than the ones that you see. The bee also is sensitive to magnetic energy, so it's experiencing magnetic fields of which you're completely oblivious. So now ask yourself the following really stupid question. Who's right? Is the room the way I see it? Is the room the way the dog sees it? Or is the room the way the bee sees it? And you realize that the moment you ask that question, it's a foolish question. There is no way the room is. There's only a way the room shows up for you. the way the room shows up for your dog, the way the room shows up for the bee. And what that means is that the qualities that the room has depend upon your nervous system and your concepts and your purposes from your perspective, depend upon your dogs from your dog's perspective, depend upon the bees from the bee's perspective. And so what constitutes the world is as much coming from the side of our consciousness as anything coming from the side of the world. And that's what we mean by interdependence on conceptual imputation. We don't find an independent world that our minds just register. Rather, we co-construct the world with everything in the world. And again, that's something that I think that Western philosophers can learn from Buddhist philosophers, because most of our models of knowledge and experience presuppose a world that's in a particular way, and then a mind or perceptual systems that simply reflect that. What the philosopher Richard Rorty called the idea of the mind as a mirror of nature, where nature exists independently and our minds just reflect it. And we've got good perception if our minds have the way we give us the world exactly as it is independently. And if they don't, then there's something wrong with us. But when we think about it from a Buddhist perspective, we think of the mind and the world as co-creating. So there's those three levels of interdependence. Now, when you see dependent origination in that way, and you stop seeing a world of permanent objects that we could register exactly as they are, with the properties that they have independently, and when you stop seeing things that way, and start seeing a world as constituted by a constantly changing, interdependent set of conscious and unconscious processes, then you see that when we ask the question, well, what's the world really like? There's no answer to that question. That there is no way the world really is. There's only ways that the world shows up at a particular moment for a particular being. Then we can say that the world is empty of having any particular way that it is, any particular essence, any particular nature. And when we talk about emptiness, that's what we mean. Emptiness is the giving up of the idea that there's a way the world is, that it is independently, that we simply grasp and say there simply is no way that the world is. That very idea is incoherent. And when you see it that way, you see that emptiness is just the flip side of dependent origination. The great Tibetan philosopher Tsongkhapa put it this way. He said that emptiness and dependent origination are extensionally equivalent. They're the same thing, but they're intentionally distinct. They're that same thing seen in two different ways. One is seeing things through the process of causal, conceptual, and part-whole dependent origination. The other is seeing things through the lens of asking the question, what's the final nature of things? And realizing that when we look for that ultimate nature, we come up empty.
Still, though, in your analogy of me, my dog, and a bee, you know, perceiving the room in different ways, or perceiving the objects in the room in different ways, we're still three organisms in a room that to my Western mind, it exists independently of us. Or if I'm taking my dog through a walk in nature, and I see a flower, I appreciate how it looks, and my dog appreciates how it smells, and then the bee is engaging in this process of pollination from flower to flower. We're still interacting with flowers, even though we perceive the flowers differently. And so minimally, it seems like when it comes to perceptual properties such as color, because the wavelengths themselves don't have color, that could be not just subjective but dependent on each kind of organism. But when it comes to its substantial existence, it seems like it is independent of us. And so I know a Buddhist would reject that. So how would a Buddhist respond to that?
Okay, that's a really good question. So the first thing to point out is that the analysis of the world as empty is not the analysis of the world as non-existent. Emptiness and non-existence are two very different things. One way to put this point is when we say that things are empty, we don't say that they don't exist. What we're saying is that the only kind of existence they can have is existence as empty things, existence
Mm.
as interdependent phenomena. So, when we look at the flower, to take that very nice example, maybe it's a lily, and so I see it as white, um, and the bee sees it as having all of these amazing colors that are kind of leading into the center that provide that kind of runway for it. And my dog is only experiencing a volume of smell that might happen
Mm.
to have some color that doesn't even register for it because all it cares about is the smell. Um, we can ask the question, are there similar sets of causes and conditions on the side of the object for all of our experiences? We might say, well, yes, some of those causes and conditions are the same, some of them are different. Is it a fact that the lily is white, or that the lily has purple and red spots on it as the bee might see it, or that there's no particular color at all, just a smell, the way my dog would see it? There is no fact of the matter there. So if we ask, what's essential about the lily? How does it really look? How does it really smell? What are its real properties? There's no answer to that question. It's empty of all of those. That doesn't mean that it's non-existent. That means that it comes to exist as the object it is for each of us, independent not only on things from its own side, but also on conditions from our side. But it also calls our attention to the fact that that lily isn't by itself an object. It came into existence depending upon a bulb and depending upon rain and sunshine and soil. It will transform into rotting humus that will then maybe become the nutrition that's going to create another thing, maybe a rose, in the next spring. That rose itself is going to pass out of existence and become something else. Each of these things is nothing but a stage in a complicated set of interdependence. And each of these stages appears differently to all kinds of different beings. So if we ask, what makes this lily a lily? The answer is nothing at all, except our decision to carve this particular aspect, this particular moment of a long chain of interdependence out as a particular object. Um, and so when we ask ourselves, what makes the world that we experience the world that we experience? We can talk about causes and conditions and dependent origination, but to talk about anything that has its own independent existence is to falsify reality.
Okay, okay. So I have to remember that emptiness does not equal just non-existence, right? And
No,
and that
no,
and that
emptiness. Hypothesis.
Buddhism emphasizes how, I mean, the doctrine of two truths, how there's ultimate reality, which is empty, and how there's conventional reality,
That's right.
that we just engage in, that allows us to engage morally, um, and so on. So I have to remember that, and the third noble truth related to how we perceive the world would be about the cessation of suffering, right? Or
That's right.
nirvana. So
Hmm.
could you expand on this concept of nirvana or nibbana in Pali and explain
Yep.
some misconceptions about it as well? For example, it's not quite a Buddhist heaven to which one goes in the
No.
afterlife.
No. Nirvana, the metaphor is kind of beautiful. Buddhism, like most philosophical and religious traditions, is built on lots of metaphors. And again, one of the reasons for looking at different traditions is to give yourself a richer diet of metaphors through which to see the world. Um, when we think about nirvana means literally blowing out a flame going out, a candle going out, or a fire going out. So it's a cessation of something, not a positive thing. It's, but it's not the cessation of existence. It's the cessation of burning. So let me connect it to another metaphor, or to its family of metaphors, because Buddhism is full of these fire metaphors. Um, When we ask about what the person is in Buddhist philosophy, Buddhists, of course, are famous for the doctrine of no self or no soul, that there's no core to a person. And when Buddhists ask what there isn't, when you ask what is there instead, we say there's no self, there's a person. But a person, because everything is interdependent, everything is dependently originated, depends upon its components. And the Buddhists call those components skandhas, which means piles. It's sometimes translated as aggregates. Clusters is a really good translation. But if we ask where that word it comes from the Pali Kana, which originally refers to a very particular pile. And that's the pile of wood one constructs when you're cremating a corpse. So when we think about what persons are, we say, well, you're just a pile of things, perceptions, sensations, emotions, actions, physical characteristics, but there's no core to them. The metaphor that's being used is this pile of wood that's on fire. And so there's a famous Buddhist sutta, a very famous Buddhist teaching, where the Buddha says, hey, monks, the entire world's on fire. Our physical form is on fire. Our sensations are on fire. Our perceptions are on fire. Our personality traits are on fire. Our consciousness is on fire. Nirvana is the end of that fire. Now, that's really important because the metaphor of dukkha now connects to the metaphor of fire. So when we say that the world is unsatisfactory, that it's permeated like by pain, the real heart of that metaphor is we live on a world that is just flaming, that's on fire, that's burning. And when you recognize the fact that the world is metaphorically burning with suffering, what you want is to put that fire out. And so nirvana, this idea of the fire going out, the cessation, is connected to that metaphor of who we are. But when you put the fire out, you don't want the pile to go away. You just don't want it to be burning anymore. So when we think about the first truth being the truth of suffering, and the second truth being the truth of the origin of suffering, the third truth says you can put that fire out if you eliminate attraction and aversion, and you can eliminate those by eliminating primal confusion. That's why philosophy is at the center of Buddhist practice, because it's philosophically that we uproot the confusion of ourselves as persons with selves. We uproot the confusion of the impermanent with the permanent. We uproot the confusion of the empty with the non-empty. And if we can do that, we can replace attraction with aspiration. We can replace aversion with a commitment to eliminate an impersonal commitment. And so we can come to live in a world that we experience as interdependent, as impermanent, as empty of intrinsic identity, and to live in that world without it being a source of suffering, but rather a source of happiness. And that's what nirvana means. It doesn't mean going someplace else, leaving this world and entering heaven. It means living in this world without being constantly on fire.
In your book, you write, quote, dukkha is caused by a misperception of reality, a cognitive
Mm-hmm.
superimposition of permanence, independence, and intrinsic nature on things that lack it. Therefore, dukkha can be alleviated by and only by the cessation of this superimposition, unquote. And this is really cool to me too because my mom has a PhD in natural health sciences, and when her
Mm-hmm.
clients come with a problem, fatigue, bloating, inflammation, even psychological things such as anxiety, she says these are almost always symptoms of root causes, right? And so to
Mm-hmm.
get at the symptoms, you want to eliminate the root causes with diet and lifestyle
Precisely.
practices. And so this third ennobling truth is that the elimination of suffering is possible through the elimination of its causes. And I think that's really beautiful and powerful.
Yep. And the medical metaphor is pretty obvious there, right? So very often Buddhists will say, that Buddhism is a kind of medical treatment. The Buddha is the physician who diagnoses the illness. the Dharma, the Buddhist doctrine, the way of understanding the world, is the prescription that you follow in order to eliminate the cause of the illnesses. And the Sangha, the third of the refuge jewels, the Buddhist assembly, well, that's the nurse. They're the people who make sure you take your medicine and help you on the path. So and one of the epithets of the Buddha that you'll see in Sanskrit literature is the great physician. So the fact that your mom is seeing the world this way is not surprising.
Hmm. The great physician. What do you know when that epithet arose in Buddhist literature?
I don't know,
It's
but we
because Christians also call Jesus the great physician, and I'm wondering if there's a
uh,
connection or if that's just a happy
well,
coincidence.
I think it's a happy coincidence because I think that it certainly arises in the Buddhist world well before we have
Okay.
interaction of Buddhism and Christianity. I think it's a happy coincidence.
Okay. Well, we're coming sort of short on time, so the fourth and final ennobling truth is the eightfold path, and
Yeah.
a broadly Buddhist ethical framework is not necessarily systematic and not easily boxed in to a set Western category such as consequentialism or deontology. The eightfold
Yeah.
path is a practical path, just that involves right view. Let's see if I think I have
Mhm.
a slide that I alrety made. It
I hope so.
involves, there we go.
Whenever anybody tries to list them, they forget one. So that's good.
Okay, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right effort, right livelihood, right mindfulness, and right concentration or meditation. So
Yeah.
we could discuss all of these if you'd like, or I have a specific question about meditation as well.
Go specific. Go specific.
Okay, okay. I mean, my main question about meditation is two. One, what was the Buddha's approach to meditation and what value
Mhm.
does it have today? Because this isn't something you really discussed in depth in your book. And then also, how can one be mindful of emptiness? Like, maybe that's just a problem in English, in the English language, because concentration denotes like your mind being full of something. And maybe that's not
Mhm.
how it's meant in Buddhism.
Yeah, it's not actually. It's
Okay,
and
okay.
I think that translation is a really problematic one. It's become standard, but it's problematic. So let me start with the second question and work my way back into the first.
Okay.
First about meditation and then about mindfulness. Um, there are many, many meditative practices in the Buddhist world. And the Buddha himself talks about many of them, and then many have evolved since then. But here's really what, in a fundamental way, they have in common. It's one thing to sort of come to understand these philosophical ideas, to understand what impermanence is, and interdependence, and emptiness, and why it's important to be patient and not angry, why it's important to develop care and not sloppy sympathy, why it's important to be a good friend, right, and not to be partial, and to really believe all of that stuff, but for it not to become part of your life. Um, a psychoanalyst friend of mine used to say that's it's like adding insight to injury. That now you know a bunch of stuff, but it doesn't have any real impact. Um, and I think a lot of people go through a lot of their life that way, kind of knowing what's right, but not, but it not transforming them, not being personally transformative. I'm going to give you a kind of analogy here, and then explain what meditation does. Um, if you've ever taken an art history class, then you'll kind of remember that before you took your first art history class, when you went to a museum, you saw a lot of pretty pictures. And that was nice. But after an art history class, you say, wow, look at this impressionist masterpiece. Look at this piece of cubism. Look at this piece of abstract expressionism. And suddenly you're seeing things that you never saw before. But there was a point while you were taking that class where you said things like, okay, impressionism. I'm going to be looking for a particular way of representing light and particular kinds of brush strokes. And if I see those, it's impressionist, right? And you're kind of studying and learning and doing it inferentially. And then there comes to be a point where you just see those things. Now, Buddhism is about transforming our experience of ourselves in the world. It's not about knowing what it is to be a good friend. It's being friendly. It's not about knowing what it is to care about others. It's to become caring. And what meditation is the way of taking all of these things that we know and going over them and visualizing in our mind till they become the way we see the world. So when we do meditations on care, we might begin by thinking about what care is and why we should care about other people, even though we might not, and do the visualizations and the practices that allow us to become caring. So meditation is where we transform what we know into how we experience. I might know that anger is the wrong way to respond to an insult. But the first time somebody calls, says, "Oh, Garfield, you stupid asshole," I say, "What the fuck do you mean I'm a stupid asshole? Do you want to take this outside?" And then I say, "Oh, I shouldn't have responded that way," right? That means even though I know that anger is bad, I'm still an angry person, not a patient person. But through meditative practice, I try to transform my knowledge of patience into real patience. So when somebody says, "Garfield, you stupid asshole," I say, "It sounds like you're having a bad day." Um, and that's a different kind of response that might lead to a different place. Now, the term that's translated as mindfulness, coming back from 8 to 7, is the Sanskrit term is smrti, and what its principal meaning is memory, remembering, or recollection, or calling to mind. So when we talk about that, what it means is remembering what's important to you, remembering the principles to which you consider, right? It's like when your mom asks you, "Who do you think you are? What kind of person are you?" And you say, "Oh my God, that's right. I'm not behaving the way that I really take myself to
Mm-hmm.
be." So that notion of right smrti, of right recollection or calling to mind, means trying to keep in focus who you want to be and what principles you take to be important and not forgetting them in the heat of the moment. So that's why it goes very much together with the idea of meditation, because meditation helps you cultivate that attitude of remembering what's important and not letting that slip. Because remember, all of the Eightfold Path, all of it, is about how we experience the world. And the way to understand what's going on in the Buddhist ethical tradition that makes it very different from most, not all, but most of Western ethical traditions is that it's really about transforming our experience and our vision rather than thinking about how to act. When you see somebody as a friend, you don't have to ask yourself the question, how should I behave towards them? Um, when a doctor sees somebody as a patient and cares for them, she doesn't have to say, "Oh, gee, I wonder what I should do." The care delivers a spontaneous sort of response. And so Buddhism is about cultivating that kind of responsiveness towards the world. And by cultivating that responsiveness, we're cultivating a way of seeing it. Meditation and recollection are tools for allowing us to transform our vision.
Hmm. That's very powerful, and I appreciate that. We're coming to the end of it, and so as the brief conclusion to every video, I ask my guests three more personal questions that you can answer however in-depth or briefly as you'd like. But the first is just, what's one significant thing on which you've changed your mind, whether from studies or conversations or even personal experience?
That's a really good question. I think that I've changed my mind dramatically over the years about the structure of ethics. That when I began my philosophical career, I was very, very much convinced of the correctness of a Kantian social contract kind of theory about ethics and politics, and the centrality of rights and duties and human dignity to ethical theory. And studying Buddhism has made me has changed the way that I've seen that, and I've thought of ethics far more in terms of this kind of transformation of perception and moral phenomenology. And I'm very grateful for that.
Hmm. Now, the second question is just what are some more personal factors? That is, uh, things that don't necessarily constitute propositional evidence, but they still influence your worldview.
Yeah. Um, The fact that as one, well, let me, it's personal. The fact that I've made an effort to become more responsive and less reactive, and to see the world more through the lens of interdependence and the ubiquity of suffering. I think I've become not only a happier person, but a more effective person. And when I look at the people who I know and respect who have cultivated traits like this, I've really come to see them as deeply important.
More responsive and less reactive. Okay, I'll remember that too. And the final thing is just any final thoughts or further resources that you'd recommend to me or to our audience.
My final thoughts are that whatever philosophical traditions you've studied, study another one. If you've only studied one, pick another one and study it. If you've only studied two, pick a third one. Because the more resources we access, the wiser we can become and the deeper an understanding we can have of those that we've already studied.
Well, thank you so much. To you, Dr. Garfield, I'm grateful for your time and for your mind. And to our audience, I hope you've been challenged and enlightened. So, to everyone, peace.